The December wind did not simply blow it cut. It slid like glass shards down empty avenues, rattled against the iron bones of the city, and howled through alleys as though it meant to strip the world bare. Snow fell heavy, erasing footsteps, muting car horns, drowning the city in a silence that felt unnatural. Manhattan, usually restless, had become a ghost of itself. Ethan Cole walked through it as though he belonged to that silence. His figure, tall and sharply tailored, seemed immune to the cold at first glance. But the truth was different. His coat was Italian wool, sleek and expensive. Yet it did nothing to shield him from the storm inside his chest. He had turned 40, only weeks ago, but it already felt like a sentence rather than a milestone. His marriage was collapsing in courtrooms that smelled of paper and bitterness. His house, once filled with voices, music, the hum of dinners and laughter, was now cavernous, echoing back his loneliness louder than any argument could, even his company. A billion-dollar empire, with his name stamped across towers of glass and steel, felt like a mausoleum of his own ambition. The black Mercedes behind him purred against the snow bank, its warmth useless. He adjusted his scarf, trying to fight the sting of winter on his skin, when a sound reached him. It was faint, soft enough to be mistaken for the rustle of wind, through newspapers stuck to a wall. But Ethan stopped. Instinct told him this was not the storm. He turned, his gaze cutting through the haze of falling snow, and froze. Near a pair of overflowing trash bins, half buried in frost, was a small figure, a child, no older than 9. Dark hair matted with ice, hands raw and trembling, rifling through discarded wrappers as if searching for treasure. Her jacket was torn, a sleeve hanging by threads, shoes soaked through to the skin. Her lips were tinted the dangerous blue of a flame burning out, and yet, when she lifted her face, when her eyes met his, Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Those eyes, dark, steady, unflinching, did not belong to someone begging for mercy. They belonged to someone holding herself upright through sheer will. She did not whimper or shrink. She whispered instead, her voice fragile, but practiced, like a line rehearsed too many times. "I just need food, sir." The words sliced deeper than the winter wind. Ethan had faced rivals who tried to tear down his empire, investors who demanded more than he could give, lawyers who clawed for every piece of his life, and none of them had undone him like those 5 words from a child, half swallowed by snow. She explained herself quickly, almost apologetically, as though she feared being mistaken for a nuisance. "Sometimes," she said, "the office workers threw sandwiches in these bins. Sometimes she found enough to last a day." She promised she would clean up after herself. She was not trying to cause trouble. The way she spoke, formal, careful, her small body shaking, yet her tone controlled, twisted something in Ethan's chest. No 9-year-old should have to sound like that. No child should feel the need to make suffering palatable. He felt his throat tighten. Without thinking, he shrugged off his coat. The fabric was heavy in his hands, warm from his own body. He stepped toward her, the snow crunching beneath his shoes, and draped it around her narrow shoulders. It swallowed her completely, the sleeves dangling past her fingers, the hem dragging in the slush. But she pulled it close, holding it as though it were not a coat, but a shield. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his voice lower than he intended. She hesitated only for a second, breath forming mist between them. "Willow," she whispered. The storm raged around them, swallowing the street in white. But in that moment, Ethan's world narrowed to the fragile figure before him. A girl named Willow, trying to survive a night no child should face alone. And there, in the frozen silence of New York, Ethan Cole made a choice he hadn't planned. "Come with me, Willow," he said, his tone firm, almost startling himself. "You cannot stay here." For a heartbeat, she simply stared at him, as though weighing the risk. Then, slowly, she nodded, clutching the oversized coat tighter. She rose on unsteady legs. He guided her toward the waiting car, unaware that this single act, born from instinct, not strategy, would unravel secrets, ignite battles, and awaken something in him that wealth had long buried. As the door closed behind them and the Mercedes rolled into the storm, the world outside blurred. For Ethan, the empire he had built no longer mattered. For the first time in years, only this child did. And with that silent shift, destiny began to move. The ride through the city felt endless, though Ethan had never taken the streets more carefully in his life. His hands, usually steady on the wheel, tightened until the leather pressed creases into his palms. He drove like the car itself carried something fragile, something that might shatter if he moved too quickly, snow lashed against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep pace, while the child Willow sat silent beside him. She seemed almost too small for the seat, swallowed by his coat, her chin barely visible above the collar as she pressed herself against the warmth of the vents. Her eyes remained open at first, cautious, scanning the interior as if memorizing every detail. But exhaustion soon pulled her under, her head tipped softly against the glass, breath shallow. Fingers still knotted in the sleeve of his coat as, though afraid it might be taken back, Ethan glanced at her more than he did at the road, unsettled by the quiet weight in the air. He was a man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking, but one small girl asleep in his passenger seat made him feel more responsible than any empire ever had done by the time the car slid into the underground garage of his building. The storm had thickened, walls of snow smothering the city. Ethan stepped out, circling to open her door, careful not to startle her. She stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering, but she did not resist as he lifted her. For a man used to carrying heavy burdens in silence, the weight of her felt impossibly light, like holding air that had almost given up on existing. The elevator ride stretched into eternity. Glass mirrors reflected an image he hardly recognized, a tall man in a tailored suit, carrying a child wrapped in his own coat. They looked like strangers forced together by fate, to broken halves of entirely different stories crossing paths in the eye of a storm. When the doors opened, the world transformed into polished marble, soaring ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows painted black by the snow outside. Willow blinked, her gaze sweeping across the space. The penthouse was warmth and light, but her posture stiffened as though she had stepped into enemy territory. She shifted in his arms, not to escape, but to orient herself, scanning corners, searching for exits. Ethan set her gently on her feet, and she clutched the coat tighter, staring at the gleaming floors. "Are you hungry?" he asked softly, kneeling slightly so his voice wouldn't loom over her. She nodded, but her answer came with careful restraint. "If it's not too much trouble, sir, I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Her words cut through him like a blade. Not a whine, not a demand, just practiced politeness. As though she had learned that hunger must always come wrapped in apology, Ethan straightened, guilt flooding his chest as he opened the refrigerator. Rows of untouched takeout, bottles of wine, fruit spoiling in trays nothing meant for a child who had gone a day without food. He listed off options quickly, trying to offer something, anything that might spark joy. Pizza, burgers, Chinese. Food, her answer silenced him. "Soup, please. Something warm. My stomach has been empty for a while." Ethan's throat constricted. A girl who could have begged for anything had asked only for soup, not indulgence, but survival. He placed an order immediately, the sound of his own voice unsteady as he spoke. To the restaurant. When he turned back, she was standing at the window, her small figure silhouetted against the storm. She touched the glass as though it were a barrier she both longed for and feared. "Where do you usually stay?" he asked gently. She spoke without turning, her tone strangely calm. "Sometimes in the car my mom left, sometimes in stairwells. The trash here is food. It's enough if I'm careful." The words fell like stones into the quiet room. Ethan's chest tightened until breathing hurt. He had lived in a fortress of glass and steel, and yet here was a child who measured life in stairwells and scraps. She turned then, her eyes catching his, not with shame, but with the resilience of someone who had learned not to ask for pity. "I promise I can take care of myself," she said softly. The statement struck him harder than the storm outside. It was armor, yes, but beneath it, a quiet plea lingered. A child who should have been worried about homework and playgrounds was instead convincing strangers she was strong enough to survive. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears when the soup finally arrived. She sat at the counter and ate slowly, carefully, as though each spoonful was a treasure that might vanish. She stopped halfway through, setting the bowl down with a whisper. "Too much at once makes me sick. I'll save the rest." Ethan found himself staring, not at a child broken by hunger, but at someone stronger than most adults he had ever known. This was survival carved into bone, strength forged in cold nights and discarded scraps. He felt something shift inside him, a weight heavier than profit margins or contracts. For the first time in years, someone else's tomorrow mattered more than his own empire. When he showed her the guest room white sheets, warm blankets, soft light, she touched everything with reverence, as though afraid it might vanish if she blinked. Standing in the doorway, Ethan watched her curl beneath the covers, whispering a polite, "Good night, sir," before her eyes closed, and in that stillness, Ethan Cole realized something terrifying and undeniable. His life had been empty, and this child he had found in the snow had just filled it with meaning. Ethan woke with a start the next morning, unsure if the events of the previous night had been some cruel dream. The storm still raged outside, the glass walls of the penthouse trembling faintly with the wind, but the silence within carried a different weight. For a moment, he thought perhaps he had imagined her the small figure with frost in her hair, the quiet voice asking only for food, the fragile body wrapped in his coat. He rubbed his temples, wondering if loneliness and guilt had finally conjured ghosts. Then he heard the soft clatter of dishes, the sound of running water. Not the echo of staff or housekeepers, but the measured rhythm of small hands trying. To be precise, Ethan slipped from his room, padding barefoot across the cold marble, and stopped dead at the threshold of the kitchen. There she was, Willow, standing on a chair to reach the sink, sleeves rolled up over wrists still far too thin, carefully washing the bowl she had used for soup. She moved slowly, disciplined, almost reverently, as though she believed the act itself was a privilege. Her hair, once tangled with frost, was now neatly braided. Damp strands clinging to her temples, and draped over her small frame was one of his shirts, far too large, falling to her ankles like a dress. She glanced over her shoulder when she sensed him, her face brightening with a smile that was polite, not assuming. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice light but careful. "I hope I did not wake you. I wanted to make coffee for you, but I couldn't reach the machine." Ethan's throat tightened. This wasn't how children were supposed to sound. No 9-year-old should carry the quiet discipline of someone trained by hardship. He managed a nod, though his chest ached. "You didn't wake me," he said softly, "but you don't have to do that." She shrugged gently, as though the weight of responsibility was natural. "I don't like leaving messes." They sat for breakfast together, though the word felt foreign in his mouth. He offered her cereal, toast, fruit, things he hadn't touched in years but kept stocked by habit. She chose cereal, dry, pouring only a small portion into the bowl. She ate slowly, carefully, never wasting a crumb. As they sat in the quiet, Ethan asked the question that had pressed against him since the night before. "Do you go to school?" She looked down at her bowl, her spoon pausing midair. "Sometimes. Well, we still had the apartment. I went. But after that, no, it was hard to stay in one place. People ask too many questions." The way she said, a matter of fact, as though she had rehearsed the truth into something palatable, sent a ripple of unease through him. A child whose survival depended on disappearing, on never asking for too much. Trying to change the subject, he picked up a pen and a napkin. "Do you like puzzles?" Her face lifted, and for the first time, he saw a spark that wasn't shadowed by caution. "Yes." He scribbled numbers down. "What comes next?" 3, 7, 15, 31, 63. She frowned, eyes narrowing. Then, suddenly, they lit up. 127. Each number doubles and then adds 1. Ethan stared at her, stunned. That was no guess. That was sharp, precise logic, faster than most adults he knew. He scribbled another, more complex sequence. Again, she solved it without hesitation. Patterns, equations, percentages. Each answer slid from her lips with clarity that unsettled him. This wasn't just intelligence. This was brilliance. A kind of intuitive genius he had rarely encountered, even among the engineers and mathematicians he had hired for millions of dollars. He leaned back, watching her work quietly through each puzzle, her lips moving silently as she checked patterns. This wasn't the voice of a child begging to survive. This was the voice of a mind hungry for knowledge, one that had been starved far longer than her stomach. Later that morning, when she drifted to the couch, Ethan lingered in the doorway. She sat cross-legged, his heavy coat still wrapped around her shoulders, a book far too advanced for her age resting open in her lap. She read slowly, lips moving faintly, pausing not to fidget but to think, to connect ideas. She was not simply reading, she was learning how to own knowledge. At one point, she looked up at him with those impossibly steady eyes. Why do people build tall buildings if storms always come and make them shake? The question stunned him. He set his papers down, suddenly aware of how small his answers might sound. Because storms pass, he said finally, and when they pass, the building is still standing. That's what strength is. She nodded. thoughtful, her voice quiet but firm. So it's like people, storms come, but if they are strong, they can keep standing. Ethan's chest ached. He had spent his life believing strength was profit, influence, reputation. And here was a girl who had lived on scraps and stairwells, teaching him that true strength was simply refusing to fall when storms came. As evening bled into the city, he stood alone at his office window, watching snow blur the skyline. His phone buzzed liars about the divorce, board members demanding his attention, but he ignored them. He picked it up once, thumb hovering over the contact for social services. Logic screamed at him to call, to hand her to the system designed for children like her. But then he looked across the room. There she was, curled on the couch, pen in hand, copying numbers into the margins of the book as though solving puzzles was her way of surviving the chaos. She looked peaceful, though the world had given her none. Ethan Cole lowered the phone, his voice, when he finally spoke to his attorney, was steadier than it had been in months. "Tell me what I need to do to keep her safe with me." He hung up, leaning against the doorway, eyes never leaving her. For the first time in years, he understood something deeper than wealth, deeper than empire. She had not arrived by chance. She was here because she was meant to be, and in that quiet, snowbound penthouse, Ethan realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the one within. But this time, he had someone worth weathering it for. The following days passed like a dream Ethan could not shake himself from. His penthouse, once a fortress of silence, now held the faint sounds of movement, tiny footsteps across marble, pages turning, the clink of dishes being carefully washed by small hands. Willow's presence filled corners that had long felt hollow. Each morning, she woke before him, already tidying, already carrying herself with a discipline that unsettled him. And each evening, she sat with a book or a puzzle, eyes gleaming, with the quiet fire of a mind that refused to be wasted. But beneath that warmth, a shadow grew. Ethan knew what society would say, that he had no right to keep her, that she belonged to the state, to social services, to a system already flooded with children forgotten by everyone else. He knew the logical path, the safe path, the one that kept his reputation clean. Yet logic faltered each time he looked at her, each time she asked questions about strength, or solved patterns with ease, or whispered good night with a politeness that broke his heart. He couldn't let her disappear into the machinery of a system that treated children as numbers instead of lives. It was late one night when the storm inside him broke. He stood at the window. The city lights blurred through falling snow, his reflection staring back at him. Behind him, Willow slept on the couch, her small frame curled beneath the coat she still refused to let go of. He picked up his phone, thumb hesitating over contacts that could decide her fate. Then, with a deep breath, he dialed his attorney. "Tell me," Ethan said, his voice low but steady, "what I need to do to keep her safe with me." There was silence on the other end, then a long exhale. "Mr. Cole, this is not simple. Guardianship, foster care, adoption, it's a process. The courts will ask questions. They will pry into your life. Then let them pry," Ethan said firmly, eyes fixed on the sleeping child. "This isn't business. This isn't strategy. This is," he faltered, then finished softly, "this is what matters." For the first time in years, he felt conviction not tied to profit margins or contracts. He felt purpose. The days that followed blurred with paperwork, hushed conversations with lawyers, and sleepless nights as he weighed risks he could not calculate. Willow knew something was happening. Her eyes followed him with a quiet awareness, though she never asked directly. Instead, she left little drawings on his desk, numbers woven into shapes, towers with roots instead of foundations. Each one felt like a message, a silent reminder that she was building her world out of nothing, brick by fragile brick. And yet, for all his determination, Ethan could not escape the gnawing sense that fate was not finished with him. The storm had not truly passed, it had only gathered strength, waiting. The knock came on a bitter afternoon when the city was finally thawing. Ethan had just returned from a meeting with his lawyers, exhausted but determined. The sound of it, sharp, deliberate, echoing through the penthouse, sent a shiver down his spine. He opened the door expecting a delivery, maybe another stack of documents. Instead, he found a figure standing in the hallway. The first was a man in a heavy coat, his eyes sharp, carrying a leather folder tucked under one arm. A private investigator. The second was a woman, her hands trembling despite the calm mask she wore. Her eyes were rimmed red, her posture brittle as though one wrong word might shatter her. "My name is Catherine Sterling," she said, her voice fragile but urgent. "I believe you have my daughter." Ethan's world tilted. The investigator stepped forward, placing documents on the table inside photographs, records, a DNA test marked with undeniable certainty. Ethan stared at the images spread across the marble counter. A toddler with the same dark eyes, the same quiet smile. A mother cradling her child before tragedy struck. 6 years ago, during a violent break-in, Catherine Sterling's daughter had been kidnapped. The case had gone cold, until now. Willow Hazel Sterling stood frozen in the doorway of the living room, her eyes wide, confusion battling in her expression. She did not cry, she did not protest. She simply stood there, silent, as though her mind were trying to solve an impossible equation. Ethan's throat closed. His instinct was to shield her, to push the papers away, to send the strangers back into the snow, but the truth lay bare in the photographs. This girl he had saved from the trash was not a stranger with no one. She belonged to someone who had searched for her for years. The air in the penthouse grew heavy, the silence unbearable. Catherine's trembling voice broke it. "Hazel, my baby, do you remember me?" The girl clutched Ethan's coat tight around her, her eyes flickering between the woman and the man who had saved her. Her lips parted, and for the first time since he had met her, her voice wavered. "I don't know." The words sliced Ethan open. That night, long after Catherine and the investigator had left with promises to return, Ethan sat across from Willow in the dim glow of the living room. She held the coat like armor, her voice small but steady. "I don't want to lose you, but I also can't ignore her." Her words struck harder than any courtroom, harder than any contract or betrayal he had ever faced. She was not asking him to choose, she was asking how she could belong to both worlds without losing herself. And Ethan realized with a chill that his fight was no longer about protection alone. It was about something far greater, a battle for family, for belonging, for the right of a child to be more than a case number or a tug-of-war prize. The storm outside had ended, but inside Ethan Cole's life, it had only just begun. The city thawed, but Ethan's world only grew colder. Days blurred into nights of restless pacing, of endless phone calls with lawyers, of documents stacked high on his desk like walls meant to cage him in. For the first time in years, his empire, the towers, the contracts, the billions felt meaningless. All of it was dust compared to the quiet weight of the girl who sat on his couch each evening, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for answers he could not give. Catherine Sterling returned 2 days later. She carried no photographs this time, no documents, only the desperate gravity of a mother who had lost too much and waited too long. Her voice trembled when she spoke, though her eyes held a fierce determination. "She is my daughter," she told Ethan, her tone firm as though saying it aloud would anchor the truth. "Hazel belongs with me." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to demand how someone could lose a child and then simply appear 6 years later, expecting everything to return to what it once was. But the accusation died on his lips. He saw the grief in Catherine's eyes, the unspoken years of searching, of unanswered prayers. She wasn't an enemy, she was a mother. And yet, standing across from her, Ethan knew with absolute clarity that handing Hazel over without a fight would be another form of abandonment. The battle began quietly, in offices and courtrooms filled with stale air and the scratching of pens. Catherine's lawyers built their case with relentless precision, pointing to DNA results, medical records, the undeniable bond of blood. Ethan's team countered with evidence of neglect, not from Catherine herself, but from the system that had failed Hazel once already. They argued that stability mattered more than biology, that tearing Hazel from the home she had begun to trust would do irreparable harm. Hazel sat through it all with a stillness that unsettled even the judges. She was small in the heavy chairs, her feet dangling, but her presence was unshakable. While adults spoke over her head, wielding words like weapons, custody, guardianship, best interests, Hazel remained calm, her eyes scanning the room as if she were measuring not just arguments, but truths. At night, she confided in Ethan in a voice so soft he had to lean close to hear. "I don't want to choose," she whispered. "She's my mother, but you saved me." Ethan's chest ached each time she said it. He had built a life out of choices, cold, calculated, ruthless when necessary, but now, faced with a child's plea, he found himself powerless. He could not be the man who forced her to sever ties, nor the man who let her slip away. He had to be something else entirely, though he did not yet know what. The suspense tightened when the case reached its breaking point. The courtroom was crowded that morning, reporters whispering at the back, their pens hungry for a headline. Billionaire CEO fights for kidnapped child. Ethan sat rigid at the defendant's table, his face unreadable, though his pulse thundered like war drums in his chest. Across the aisle, Catherine clutched a handkerchief. Her eyes locked on the girl who sat between them. Hazel's small frame looked fragile against the towering oak of the witness stand, but her posture was steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The judge's voice was deep and slow. Hazel Sterling, do you understand that you may speak freely today, that your words will be heard? Hazel nodded once, her dark eyes never leaving the judge. Yes, Your Honor. What is it that you want? The room held its breath. Lawyers shifted, pen stilled. Even the air seemed to pause. Hazel's voice, when it came, was small but unyielding. I don't want one family, she said. I want both. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. Catherine's breath hitched, her tears spilling freely. Ethan's throat constricted, his carefully built composure cracking. Hazel continued, her words slow, deliberate, as though each one was a stone she had chosen carefully to build a bridge. I was lost for a long time, she said. I learned how to survive. I learned how to stay quiet so people wouldn't send me away. But now, I don't want to survive anymore. I want to live. And to do that, I need both of them. My mother and him. Her finger pointed to Ethan. Her gaze steady, unafraid, because he didn't walk away when he could have. The courtroom erupted, lawyers shouting, reporters scribbling, Catherine sobbing into her hands. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but nothing could silence the power of what Hazel had declared. She had cut through the legal jargon, the endless arguments, and spoken a truth so raw it shook everyone present. Ethan sat frozen, his heart slamming against his ribs. He had prepared for battle, for strategies and counterattacks, but he had not prepared for her strength. This girl, this child he had found scavenging in the snow, had just changed everything with the steady courage of her voice. When the gavel finally fell, the judge's decision was not final, but it was clear. The arrangement would not be simple, nor conventional, but Hazel's voice had been heard, and in that moment, the path forward shifted. That night, back in the penthouse, Hazel sat cross-legged on the couch, scribbling equations into the margins of a book. Ethan watched her from the doorway, his chest tight with pride and fear. She had stood taller than grown men that day, and yet, when she looked up at him, she was still just a child seeking assurance. Did I do the right thing? She asked softly. Ethan knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. His voice was steady, though his heart quaked. You did the bravest thing I've ever seen. And whatever happens next, you won't face it alone. The storm of the courtroom was over, but the war for Hazel's future had only just begun. The ruling did not come as a single strike of the gavel, but as a slow unraveling of order, like a storm deciding where it would fall. The judge's words lingered in the air long after the courtroom had emptied. We must consider the child's voice. Her desires will guide the arrangement. It was a verdict both sides had not expected, one that offered no clean victory, only a fragile path forward. Ethan left the courthouse with Hazel's hand in his. She clung to his coat sleeve with quiet certainty, her eyes unreadable. The press swarmed outside, cameras flashing in the snowflake streets, voices shouting questions. Is this a publicity stunt? Mr. Cole, are you adopting her? Catherine, do you feel justice was served? But Ethan ignored them all. For the first time in his life, headlines didn't matter. The girl beside him did. At home, the penthouse no longer felt like his alone. The silence had been replaced with small, steady signs of life. Hazel's shoes by the door, drawings scattered across the counter. The faint smell of soup simmering because she had learned to stir pots carefully. Yet despite the warmth, an unease lingered. Catherine visited often, each arrival bringing a strange tension. She came with gifts, stories from the past, photographs of a life Hazel had no memory of. Hazel received them with politeness, sometimes curiosity, but always with a distance Ethan could not decipher. One evening, Catherine arrived with a box of old toys, a stuffed rabbit, its fur worn from years of clutching, a set of wooden blocks. Hazel studied them in silence, her small hands hovering, but never quite touching. Catherine's voice broke as she whispered, "You used to sleep with this rabbit every night. You wouldn't let it go." Hazel shook her head gently, her eyes lowering. I don't remember. The room tightened with grief. Catherine's tears came quickly, spilling onto her hands as she pressed the rabbit against her chest. Ethan stood helpless, caught between empathy and guilt. This was not the cruelty of neglect, but the cruelty of time, of years stolen. Hazel looked at him then, her expression not angry, not afraid, but weighed with something heavier responsibility, as though she understood she was the bridge between the broken worlds. That night, after Catherine left, Ethan found Hazel on the balcony, staring at the city lights. She was bundled in his coat again, her breath misting in the cold. She cries. Because of me, she said quietly. Ethan stepped beside her, his hand resting on the railing. She cries because she loves you. Love isn't always quiet. Sometimes it breaks things open. Hazel thought for a moment before nodding, her small shoulders stiff with the weight of understanding. I don't want her to cry, but I don't want you to be alone again either. Her words cut through him, raw and unfiltered. For years, he had filled his life with towers of glass and steel, convinced that solitude was strength. Yet this childless 9-year-old survivor saw the truth he had hidden even from himself. He wasn't strong. He was alone, and there was a difference. The weeks ahead blurred with negotiations. Lawyers drafted an arrangement so unconventional it seemed impossible. Hazel would split her life between two homes, weekdays in Ethan's penthouse, enrolled in a rigorous academic program that challenged her brilliant mind, weekends with Catherine, rediscovering bedtime stories, lullabies, and a mother's embrace she had once been robbed of. But the plan, though balanced on paper, was anything but smooth in practice. The first weekend she spent with Catherine, Hazel returned quieter than usual. She spoke little, her eyes shadowed, though she clutched the stuffed rabbit now tucked into her bag. When Ethan asked gently if something was wrong, she shook her head. It's just strange. I feel like two different people. Ethan's chest ached, but he said nothing. He knew she was navigating something far more complex than any courtroom had prepared her for. Suspense grew when whispers began to surface. In the press, anonymous sources questioned Ethan's motives, hinting that the billionaire CEO was using a tragic child story to soften his public image. Amidst his messy divorce, paparazzi camped outside Catherine's building, flashing cameras each time Hazel visited. The girl who once scavenged in silence was now a headline, her name caught in the teeth of the media. One night, as reporters shouted questions through the gates of the penthouse, Hazel asked Ethan a question that stunned him. If I'm just a story for them, what am I really for you? The room seemed to tilt. He knelt before her, his hands steady on her shoulders, his voice breaking in a way no boardroom had ever heard. You're not a story. You're not a headline. You're the reason I finally understand what it means to live. And I will never let the world turn you into anything less than who you are. Her eyes glistened, and for the first time since he'd found her, she leaned against him willingly, resting her head against his chest. In that moment, Ethan understood the storm was far from over. The system, the press, the judgments of strangers, all of it would keep coming. But Hazel was not just surviving anymore. She was building something between him, between Catherine, between two fractured lives stitched into one fragile whole. And deep inside, Ethan felt the truth settle like a vow. His empire, his billions, his reputation, all of it meant nothing compared to protecting this child's future. What he didn't know, as the city lights flickered beyond the glass, was that the final storm was still waiting, and when it came, it would demand everything from all three of them. Spring broke across the city like a promise, but for Ethan Cole, the season carried a tension he couldn't name. The snow had melted from the streets, the sky was clearer, and yet, within the walls of his penthouse, storms lingered. Hazel's life was now split between two worlds. Catherine's small, but warm apartment, scented with lavender and worn with memories, and Ethan's high-rise fortress of glass, alive with puzzles, books, and quiet laughter that hadn't existed there before. On paper, the arrangement was settled. In reality, the balance trembled every day. As fragile as a flame against the wind, Ethan found himself watching Hazel constantly, not out of mistrust, but out of fear of missing something. Her questions, her insights, her silences. She had become the axis around which his life turned. And yet he knew he was not the only one orbiting her. Catherine's presence loomed quietly, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with grief, always with the unspoken truth that she had lost. 6 years that could never be reclaimed. One evening, Catherine came to the penthouse for dinner. The first time she had crossed that threshold since the courtroom. She entered with hesitation, her eyes tracing the marble floors, the glass walls, the empire of wealth that had housed her daughter while she searched in vain. Ethan greeted her with civility, though unease stretched between them like glass about to crack. Hazel, sensing it, filled the silence with chatter about her schoolwork, proudly showing them a project she had completed faster than anyone in her class. But it was later, when the meal was finished and the night softened, that the truth surfaced. Hazel sat between them at the kitchen counter, a pencil in her hand, scribbling equations into a notebook. Catherine watched with tears in her eyes. She was always like this, she whispered, her voice breaking. Even as a toddler, she would line up her blocks in patterns. I thought it was just play, but now I see. She was showing me who she was. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a pang of recognition and guilt. He had discovered Hazel's brilliance by accident, yet Catherine had seen the spark long ago. They were both tied to the same flame, both witnesses to her strength, both aching in different ways for what they could not claim. Alone, Hazel looked up then, her gaze sharp. You don't have to fight anymore. Her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of command. I've already decided. The room froze. Ethan leaned forward slowly. What do you mean? Hazel's pencil tapped the page. Families aren't about winning or losing. Families are built when people choose not to walk away. You, she looked at Catherine, found me once and never stopped looking. And you, her eyes moved to Ethan, saved me when everyone else looked away. I don't want one of you. I need both. Her words cut through the tension like lightning, leaving silence heavy in their wake. Catherine's breath trembled, tears slipping down her face. Ethan's throat tightened, his carefully constructed composure fracturing. In that moment, both of them understood something they had not been willing to face. Hazel was not a prize to be won, nor a burden to be passed. She was the bridge between them, the reason they both had survived their storms. The weeks that followed transformed everything. Hazel's life became a rhythm of two worlds, her resilience binding them together. Catherine began visiting the penthouse more often, not as an intruder, but as a presence Hazel welcomed. Ethan, in turn, found himself stepping into Catherine's world, small dinners at her apartment, simple evenings filled with the kind of warmth money could never buy. It was awkward, uneven, at times painful, but Hazel's steady presence held them to it, her wisdom guiding them when their own pride faltered. Suspense rippled again when the press uncovered their arrangement. Headlines screamed about the unconventional family of a billionaire CEO. Commentators debated Ethan's motives, speculating on Catherine's struggles, turning Hazel into a symbol of resilience she had never asked to be. Paparazzi hounded them both, flashes of cameras searing through car windows, voices shouting questions that twisted the truth. Ethan feared the pressure would break them. Yet Hazel surprised him once more. One night, as they drove past a cluster of reporters, she turned to him calmly. Let them talk. They don't know the truth. We do. It was the kind of wisdom that silenced his fear. The final reveal came, not in a courtroom, nor in a boardroom, but in the quiet of his kitchen one Saturday morning. Hazel sat at the counter, a calculator beside her, racing against it as she scribbled solutions faster than the machine could blink. Catherine stood nearby, her hand resting lightly on the counter, her eyes soft with something Ethan had not seen. Before peace, Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching them, the sound of Hazel's laughter filling the room like sunlight. Then Hazel set down her pencil, looked at them both, and spoke the words that closed the circle. Families aren't something you're just born into. Families are something you build when people choose not to walk away. The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was full. Ethan felt it settle into his chest like a vow. Catherine felt it wash over her as healing, years of grief finally finding rest. And Hazel felt it as freedom, proof that she did not have to choose between blood and choice, between past and future. That night, Ethan stood by the window, watching Hazel trace patterns across the glass with her finger, her small silhouette, framed against the city skyline. He realized then that his greatest legacy would not be towers or billions or headlines. It would be this child, this miracle he had found in the snow, who had saved him by needing him. The storm had ended, but his memory remained, and in that memory, Ethan Cole found the truth. Sometimes the most incredible thing a man can do is not build an empire, but save a single child and discover that she had saved him all along.